Michelle Obama and Barack Obama, icons of inspiration and hope for many, decided to take a well-deserved vacation after a series of demanding commitments. Their destination, a luxurious beachfront resort nestled along the pristine shores of an island famed for its exclusivity and opulence. This wasn't just a break. It was a moment to reconnect, relax, and find solace away from the public eye. As their black SUV rolled up to the grand entrance of the resort, the valet and concierge greeted them with mechanical politeness. Michelle stepped out first, her elegance unmistakable, dressed in a flowing white dress that danced with the coastal breeze. Barack followed, his warm smile and relaxed demeanor instantly lighting up the surroundings. Yet, something subtle and unsettling lingered in the air. The side glances exchanged by staff, the faint hesitation in their voices. It was almost imperceptible, but Michelle felt it in her gut. Years of public scrutiny had sharpened her ability to read a room. The front desk, with its marble top and extravagant floral arrangement, promised nothing but excellence. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Obama," the receptionist greeted, her voice crisp yet devoid of warmth. "Let me confirm your reservation." A few minutes ticked by as the receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard. Then came the first sign of trouble. "I'm terribly sorry, but it seems there's been a mix-up. The suite you booked isn't available. However, we've arranged alternative accommodations for you." Michelle exchanged a glance with Barack. They had booked the presidential suite weeks in advance, ensuring every detail met their standards. Barack, ever calm and composed, simply nodded and said, "That's fine. We'd appreciate it if you could fix this promptly." The receptionist's smile faltered for a brief moment. "Of course, sir. I'll see what I can do." Their assigned room, while luxurious, lacked the grandeur and privacy of the presidential suite. The balcony faced a service road rather than the ocean. The minor inconvenience was something they could overlook, but the nagging feeling persisted, a sense of being subtly sidelined. Dinner that evening offered no reprieve. The restaurant, renowned for its culinary excellence, kept them waiting for over an hour despite having a reservation. Other guests, many of whom arrived after them, were promptly seated and served. When their food finally arrived, it was lukewarm, and the waiter's demeanor bordered on dismissive. Michelle couldn't shake the growing unease. "Do you think it's just bad service? Or is there something more to this?" she asked Barack as they walked back to their room under the dimly lit pathway lined with swaying palms. Barack's face was thoughtful. "Let's not jump to conclusions, but we'll keep our eyes open." The following morning, their plans to enjoy a private cabana on the beach hit another snag. Upon arrival, they were informed that their cabana had been reassigned due to a last-minute VIP request. Instead, they were offered a pair of lounge chairs near the crowded public beach area. As they settled into their less-than-ideal spot, Michelle observed the interactions around them. Staff members were attentive and accommodating to other guests, most of whom appeared to be affluent and white. Their smiles were genuine, their service impeccable. The contrast was striking. It was during a casual stroll along the beach that Michelle's suspicions solidified. A young couple, who had recognized them, approached hesitantly. "We just wanted to say we're huge admirers of yours," the woman said. "And we couldn't help but notice how the staff here, well, they seem different with you." Her partner added, "It's subtle, but we've seen it too. You deserve better." Michelle's heart sank. What they had experienced was not just coincidence or bad luck. It was a pattern. It was systemic. Barack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with resolve. They both knew this vacation was no longer just about rest and relaxation. It had become a microcosm of the broader challenges they had spent their lives addressing: bias, inequity, and the quiet ways they manifest in everyday life. The first day of their stay at the resort seemed to be a promising escape from the daily pressures of public life. Michelle and Barack Obama had decided to take a break and enjoy some quiet time in a luxury resort tucked away in the serene countryside. The drive to the resort was peaceful, with rolling hills and expansive fields. The luxury of the place, with its majestic architecture and polished grounds, promised the type of tranquility they sought. However, Their arrival marked the beginning of a series of unsettling experiences that would slowly reveal a darker side of their vacation. Upon their arrival, the couple was greeted with the standard warm welcome from the resort staff, but something felt off. The check-in process, which should have been smooth and quick, became an uncomfortable ordeal. Despite having made reservations weeks in advance, the room they were assigned was far from the one they had requested. The view they had been promised, a picturesque outlook over the garden and lake, was now a small window facing the back alley. The front desk clerk, a young woman who seemed polite but distant, barely acknowledged the discrepancy. When Barack inquired about the error, she smiled awkwardly and shrugged, offering no explanation. As they entered their suite, they noticed further signs of negligence. The room was spacious but poorly maintained. There were stains on the carpet, and a lingering smell of mildew filled the air. The furniture was outdated, and the overall atmosphere felt unkempt for a resort of such repute. Michelle, ever the detail-oriented one, tried to maintain a calm demeanor. She suggested to Barack that perhaps the resort was simply understaffed, or that the room had been overlooked during housekeeping. Later, when they went to the resort's dining area for their first meal, the issues continued to mount. The restaurant was empty, and yet it took nearly an hour for their drinks to arrive. When their food was finally served, it was cold and lacked the sophistication they expected from a high-end resort. A glass of red wine had been spilled on the table, but the staff was slow to clean it up. The waitress, an older woman, seemed distracted and hardly interacted with them beyond the bare minimum of required service. Michelle raised an eyebrow but said nothing at first. Barack, always the diplomatic one, smiled and thanked the waitress for her efforts. But Michelle could tell he was frustrated. It wasn't just the poor service, it was the feeling of being invisible, of being treated as though their presence didn't matter. The couple exchanged glances, both trying to dismiss the feeling of discomfort creeping over them. As the night went on, the unease lingered. They overheard snippets of conversations from nearby tables, where the staff was engaging with other guests in a much warmer, more personal manner. Some guests, mostly older white couples, were greeted by name, offered personalized recommendations, and given extra attention. The Obamas, on the other hand, were treated with a professional but curt indifference. By the time they reached the resort's beach the next day, their growing sense of unease began to crystallize into something more tangible. They were eager to enjoy the sun and the ocean, but the experience at the beach was even more frustrating. As they approached the private cabanas, they were informed by a beach attendant that there were no available spots, even though the area seemed largely empty. When they inquired further, the attendant mumbled something about reservations but didn't offer any clear explanation. Michelle noticed that other guests, mostly white, were escorted directly to the beach loungers without any question or delay. Feeling increasingly alienated, Michelle and Barack decided to confront the situation directly. They made their way to the concierge desk, where Michelle asked to speak with the manager. The manager, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, listened attentively but offered no explanation for the discrepancies. Instead, he assured them that the resort's policies were in place to ensure fairness to all guests. However, there was no concrete answer as to why they had been treated differently. It was as though the manager's words were a rehearsed line, a defense meant to placate rather than address the underlying issue. By now, Michelle's patience was wearing thin. She couldn't ignore the mounting feeling that the issues they were facing weren't just simple service failures. There was something deeper at play, something they couldn't quite put into words yet, but which was becoming increasingly clear. After the encounter with the manager, Michelle and Barack walked back to their room in silence. Both of them felt the weight of the situation, though neither wanted to voice their suspicions just yet. That evening, as they sat down for a quiet dinner in their room, they started to discuss what had been bothering them all day. Michelle, always attuned to subtle cues and microaggressions, expressed her concern. She remarked on the odd behavior of the staff, the dismissive attitudes, and the difference in the way they were treated compared to other guests. Barack, initially reluctant to jump to conclusions, listened carefully. They were both used to being in the public eye, but this felt different. They had encountered discrimination before, subtle, insidious, and often hard to prove. But the combination of events at the resort felt undeniable. Michelle's voice softened as she spoke, realizing that what they were experiencing might not be an isolated incident, but rather a pattern. As they continued their conversation, it became evident that the couple wasn't just dealing with poor service or bad luck. They were facing a systemic issue of racial discrimination. It was becoming clear that the resort, despite its promises of exclusivity and luxury, was not immune to the prejudices that still ran deep in society. The events of the previous day were enough to rattle Michelle and Barack. What was meant to be a quiet, restful getaway had transformed into an uncomfortable and unsettling experience. They had tried to brush off the treatment as mere coincidence, chalking it up to bad service or unfortunate timing. But deep down, both of them knew that something wasn't right. They were no strangers to the subtleties of racism, having navigated its complexities for years, both in public and private spaces. But this was different. This was a feeling of alienation, as though their very presence at the resort was an inconvenience. That evening, as they settled into their suite, the tension between them was palpable. They had spent the afternoon in relative silence, processing the events. Michelle had tried to approach the situation with patience, but the more she thought about it, the more the indignities they had faced seemed deliberate. Barack, too, had been quiet, pondering the thinly veiled dismissals, the service discrepancies, and the blatant disregard for their needs. "I can't shake this feeling, Barack," Michelle finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed the frustration she was trying to mask. "It's like they don't see us. Like we're not supposed to be here." Barack, who had been leaning against the window, staring out at the starless sky, nodded slowly. "I've been feeling the same way. But you know how it is, Michelle. Sometimes it's hard to put your finger on these things. People will deny it if we bring it up." "Maybe we don't need to bring it up," Michelle said. "Maybe we just need to make them see us. We've been quiet for too long. Maybe it's time we confront this." Barack turned toward her, his expression softening. He understood what she meant, but he knew the consequences of such actions. Confronting the staff, especially the management, might escalate the situation further. But Michelle was right. They couldn't just sit idly by, pretending nothing was wrong. They weren't those kinds of people. They had fought for equality their entire lives, and their silence now would be a betrayal to everything they stood for. After a tense moment, Barack spoke. "Okay, let's do this. But we'll need to be strategic. We can't let our emotions dictate this. We need to be firm, but we have to stay composed." Michelle nodded. The decision had been made. They would confront the issue head-on. But as they prepared to take action, they didn't anticipate how the situation would escalate so quickly, or how far the resort staff would go to defend their actions. The following morning, they decided to approach the manager again. This time, they wouldn't be passive or polite. They would demand answers. Barack, always measured, took the lead. He walked with purpose, his posture straight and his eyes focused. Michelle followed closely behind, her expression determined but controlled. As they entered the lobby, the staff barely acknowledged them. The young woman at the front desk glanced up from her phone, but quickly turned away when she saw who was standing in front of her. It was as though their presence made her uncomfortable. "We'd like to speak to the manager," Barack said calmly but with authority. "It's important." The young woman hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and disappeared into the back. Within minutes, the manager appeared. He looked even more stoic than the last time they met, his suit pressed and his demeanor cold. "I thought we had resolved everything yesterday," the manager said, his tone clipped. "Is there a problem?" Michelle didn't mince words. "Yes, there is a problem. We've been here for 2 days now, and we've been treated like second-class citizens. The service has been poor, and the staff has been dismissive. We've tried to be patient, but this is unacceptable." The manager's face remained unchanged, his eyes flicking between Michelle and Barack. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I assure you, we have a high standard of service here." "I'm not sure what you're referring to." Barack stepped forward. "You know exactly what we're talking about. Don't pretend this is just a misunderstanding." We've seen how you treat us differently from other guests. It's not just about service. It's about respect. And you failed to show us any." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step back. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying." "We're implying that you and your staff are discriminating against us," Michelle said, her voice unwavering. "We've been guests at countless resorts all over the world, and we've never experienced anything like this. Not once. But here, it's different, and it's because of who we are." For the first time, the manager's composure cracked. He hesitated, his eyes darting between them. "That's not the case. You're being unreasonable." Barack's patience was wearing thin. "Unreasonable? We're being reasonable. But we won't stay silent any longer. We're not here for a fight. But we won't let this slide either." The manager looked defeated, as if he had no more excuses left. He shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable under their scrutiny. Michelle, sensing the moment, stepped closer. "I don't care what you tell us in this room, but I want you to know that if this treatment continues, we will go public with it, and we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been treated like this before and everyone who will be treated like this in the future." Barack reached for Michelle's hand, and they both stood firm. The manager, looking beaten, sighed deeply. "I'll have the staff reviewed. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Barack shook his head. "It's not enough to just review the staff. This is a cultural issue, a systemic issue. You need to confront it, not just fix it temporarily." The manager nodded, clearly defeated. "I understand." As they turned to leave, Michelle felt a rush of satisfaction. They had confronted the issue head-on, and despite the manager's resistance, they had made their point clear. They weren't just going to be passive observers of their own treatment. They weren't going to be silenced. But the conflict wasn't over. Their confrontation with the manager had set off a chain of events they hadn't anticipated. The resort, in an attempt to salvage its reputation, began to take drastic measures. The staff, who had previously been cold and dismissive, suddenly became excessively accommodating. They treated Michelle and Barack with an almost fawning politeness, trying to overcompensate for the previous neglect. The Obamas were not fooled. They recognized the forced hospitality, the insincerity in the gestures, and the desperation in the staff's attempts to appease them. It was a stark contrast to the lack of warmth they had felt in the beginning. It was clear that the resort was now playing damage control, but the harm had already been done. The couple no longer felt like valued guests. They felt like a project, a public relations opportunity rather than a person. As they prepared to leave the resort the next day, Michelle and Barack had a brief conversation on their way to the car. "This is just the beginning," Michelle said, her tone resolute. "We have to keep pushing. For all the people who aren't in a position to speak out." Barack nodded. "It's not just about us. It's about setting an example, showing that silence is not an option." The morning after their confrontation with the resort manager, Michelle and Barack were finally ready to move past the conflict. The weight of the situation had left an indelible mark on both of them, but they were resolute in their belief that speaking out had been the right decision. However, despite the manager's assurances, they couldn't shake the lingering discomfort that had settled over their stay. As they packed their belongings in the luxurious yet impersonal suite, Michelle took a deep breath. The events of the past few days had unearthed so many emotions: anger, frustration, sadness, but also a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the unfair treatment they had faced at the resort. It was about the broader societal implications of their experience. They had done their part to make sure the management understood the issue, but they also knew that it was just a small step in a larger, ongoing fight for equality and respect. "We've got to keep this conversation going, Barack," Michelle said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "It's not enough to just call out one incident. We need to raise awareness, bring attention to the patterns of discrimination that happen every day, and let people know that they can stand up, too." Barack nodded in agreement. "We've talked about it before, about how it's not just about us, but about everyone who doesn't have a voice. This is our chance to make a difference." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Barack went to open it, and it was the resort's public relations team. Eager to make amends, they had been instructed by management to offer them a special gesture to ensure their satisfaction, though it felt more like a forced attempt at damage control than a genuine effort to apologize. Mr. and Mrs. Obama, we just wanted to personally apologize for the treatment you've received. One of the PR representatives began. We truly value your patronage, and we'd like to offer you a complimentary stay at one of our other properties as a gesture of goodwill. Michelle and Barack exchanged a glance, each knowing that their decision to speak up had led to this moment. The offer, while polite, felt hollow, another attempt to smooth things over without addressing the core issue. We appreciate the gesture, Michelle replied, her tone measured. But we're not here for compensation or freebies. What matters is that this kind of treatment doesn't happen again. And not just here, but everywhere. It's bigger than just this resort. The PR team seemed taken aback but quickly regained their composure. We understand, and we're committed to making changes to ensure this doesn't happen again. We will begin immediate diversity and sensitivity training for all our staff and management. Barack raised an eyebrow. Training is a start, but it's not enough. The real work starts when you look at your policies and the underlying culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. It's not just about addressing the symptoms. It's about confronting the root causes. Michelle nodded. The system has to change. It can't just be a one-time fix. You need to create a culture of respect, not just for some, but for all your guests. The PR representatives were silent for a moment, and then one of them said, "Thank you for your feedback. We'll pass it along to management." They left the room, and the door clicked shut behind them. Barack and Michelle stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just transpired. They both felt a sense of accomplishment. They had stood their ground and made their point. But they also understood that this was far from over. "We've made an impact here," Michelle said, her voice full of resolve. "But the real challenge is ensuring that these conversations continue beyond this moment. We need to take action on a larger scale." "We will," Barack responded, his gaze intense. "We'll use our platform to keep pushing for change, whether it's through policy, through public discourse, or through whatever means we have at our disposal." The couple packed up the last of their belongings and prepared to leave the resort. As they walked out the door, they could feel the eyes of the staff on them, some of them looking embarrassed, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Michelle and Barack had left an indelible mark on the resort, but they knew that the impact would extend far beyond its walls. The drive to the airport was quiet, but there was a sense of peace between them. The tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced with a sense of pride. They had stood up for what they believed in, and they had made their voices heard. As they boarded the plane, Michelle looked out the window, reflecting on the larger fight that lay ahead. They had taken a small step in addressing the issues of systemic racism and inequality, but there was still so much more to be done. "We're just getting started," she said softly, more to herself than to Barack. Barack placed a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, we are. And we'll keep fighting until it's no longer just about us. It's about everyone who deserves a fair shot. A shot at being seen, heard, and respected." The plane took off, the wheels lifting them into the air. As they flew over the land below, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose, a sense that they had done something important, something that could help others. They had confronted a situation that had made them feel small, but they had turned it into an opportunity to make a difference. And that, for Michelle and Barack, was the true power of action. As the plane cruised through the sky, Michelle and Barack sat in contemplative silence. The events of the past few days had left them both physically and emotionally drained. Yet there was an undeniable sense of accomplishment in the air. They had spoken out, taken action, and stood firm in their commitment to challenge systemic issues head-on. It was not just about one incident at a luxury resort, but about making sure that their experience would never be the last one to go unnoticed. The journey back to their home was not simply a return to normalcy. It was a moment of reflection and, for Barack and Michelle, a quiet resolve that the work they had started in that remote part of the world was far from over. They knew their voices were powerful, but they also understood that change required more than just public outcry. It demanded sustained effort, grassroots mobilization, and a deep, unrelenting commitment to addressing the root causes of inequality. Upon arriving home, Michelle immediately got to work. She had been thinking about the next steps and how they could continue the conversation in a way that would bring real, lasting change. She drafted a detailed blog post, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard as she recounted the events of the trip, the conversations they had had, and the decisions they had made in the face of injustice. It wasn't just an account of a personal experience. It was an invitation for others to join in the fight, to share their own stories, and to speak out against unfair treatment wherever they saw it. Barack, too, was busy. He was on the phone with key allies, strategizing about how they could take their message to a larger stage. They began reaching out to organizations that had long been fighting for racial justice and equality, looking for ways to partner with them and lend their voices to campaigns that were already in motion. They knew that their influence could help amplify these causes, and they were determined to use it in a meaningful way. Several weeks later, a public statement was released, co-authored by Barack and Michelle, outlining the steps they were taking to support broader initiatives for equality in the hospitality industry. This statement called for increased diversity training for resort and hotel staff nationwide, an overhaul of discriminatory practices in customer service, and greater accountability for managers and executives in addressing guest complaints and concerns. It wasn't just about making demands. It was about proposing solutions that could drive sustainable change. The couple also made personal visits to a number of community organizations, offering mentorship and financial support for programs aimed at empowering marginalized communities. Their message was clear. It wasn't enough to speak about change. They needed to invest in the communities that were most affected by inequality. Michelle became more vocal about the importance of leadership development in young people, particularly those from underrepresented groups, while Barack focused on the policy changes needed to create more equitable systems. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. The media, which had initially covered their experience as a personal story, soon picked up on the larger issues at play. Headlines shifted from a tale of frustration at a resort to a broader discussion about the ways in which systemic racism permeated even the most seemingly luxurious and exclusive spaces. News outlets began to highlight the couple's role in pushing for change, and their influence continued to grow as they brought more attention to the issue. For Michelle, however, the true victory wasn't in the media coverage or the attention they received. It was in the countless messages of support they began to receive from everyday people who had been inspired by their courage. Women and men from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and inequality. Some were hotel guests who had faced similar treatment, while others were people who had never spoken up before but felt emboldened to do so after hearing Michelle and Barack's story. The real change, Michelle realized, was happening on the ground, in communities where people were learning how to raise their voices and demand better treatment. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. And progress, she believed, was the most important thing they could achieve. Barack shared her sentiment as they sat together, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a single act of courage at a resort. He spoke with a sense of quiet pride. "We've seen a lot of setbacks in our fight for equality, but what we've learned is that each step forward, no matter how small, matters. And sometimes, it takes a moment like this to remind us of what we're fighting for." Michelle nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "It's bigger than us. It always has been. And now we're in a position to make sure that the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles." They had come full circle, from the initial discomfort and frustration of their experience at the resort. They had emerged not just with a sense of resolution, but with a renewed commitment to the fight for justice. Their resolve wasn't just about righting a wrong that had been done to them. It was about making sure that everyone had a seat at the table, that everyone was heard, and that no one had to feel invisible in the spaces they occupied. The journey would continue. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Michelle and Barack were no longer just reacting to one incident. They were leading a movement, one that was determined to make a lasting impact on society. And they were ready for whatever lay ahead. With a final glance out the window, Michelle turned to Barack and smiled. "We've done something good here," she said softly. But there's still a lot more work to be done. Barack squeezed her hand, his expression filled with unwavering resolve. And we're going to keep at it, every single day. Together. They knew they were just getting started.